It's that little American hussies he's hooked up with. She's going to turn him into a Kardashian.
That's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, listen.
Over 60% of Brits want Meghan and Harry stripped of their royal titles. And now, a single podcast has pushed that number even higher. Meghan Markle's return to the mic on the Jamie Kern Lima Show was supposed to be a reset. Instead, it triggered viral backlash, accusations of fake emotion, and reignited royal outrage. Why did a tearless moment dominate headlines? What was written on that gift basket that reignited a royal controversy? And how did online users drag Joe Rogan into the fallout without him saying a word? When Meghan Markle appeared on the Jamie Kern Lima Show, released on 28 April 2025, it was presented as a rare, raw glimpse into her emotional world. Touted as her first ever podcast interview since the end of her Spotify deal, the build-up was big. The title, the thumbnail, the guest, it was all designed to land with impact. Meghan sat across from Jamie, poised yet warm, ready to talk about motherhood, identity, and vulnerability. And for a moment, it worked. She spoke about what it's like being a mother of two in the public eye. She described long days, deep exhaustion, and moments of feeling disconnected. As she described the pressures, her voice cracked. She paused, dabbed her eyes gently, and smiled through it. To the untrained eye, it looked like someone being overcome by emotion. But to millions watching online, it looked like something else entirely, an act. And it didn't take long before that interpretation took hold. Soon after the episode was published, clips began circulating across X, formerly Twitter, and YouTube. People began commenting not on what she said, but on what they didn't see. There were no tears. Her eyes weren't red. Her voice, though slightly trembling, never broke. The crying seemed too clean. Within hours, comments like, "Where are the actual tears?" and "This feels rehearsed," were everywhere. And then someone resurfaced an old clip, a short, off-camera video of Meghan from years earlier, laughing and saying she could cry on command. "Left eye," she said with a grin. "Give me 3 seconds." That clip, spliced next to the podcast footage, went viral fast. The backlash was immediate and relentless. Commentary channels, meme accounts, and podcast commentators dissected the scene frame by frame. They accused Meghan of performing sadness, not experiencing it. One side-by-side comparison of the podcast and the older video gained over 2 million views within 2 days. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a redemptive public appearance turned into another example, critics claimed, of Meghan's carefully curated image falling apart under scrutiny. The reaction wasn't just about the absence of tears. It was about context. Meghan's media appearances often follow a pattern: personal revelation, emotional expression, a moment of silence, then a pivot to strength or empowerment. On its own, the pattern might feel authentic. But repeated often enough, and especially after a clip of her laughing about manufactured tears resurfaces, it begins to look calculated. That's when older criticisms began resurfacing too. Past body language analyses, such as those by expert Scott Rouse, re-entered the conversation. Though Rouse hasn't yet publicly analyzed this new podcast, his previous assessments from earlier interviews, including the 2021 Oprah special, were back in circulation. In those reviews, he pointed to Meghan's frequent shoulder shrugs, mismatched emotional cues, and voice pitch changes as indicators that not everything being said aligned with what was being felt. While body language analysis isn't definitive proof of anything, in the social media age, it often becomes enough to sway perception. And perception is where Meghan took the biggest hit. Audiences, many of whom once supported her departure from royal life, started to question whether the vulnerability was genuine or just another piece of polished messaging. Critics accused her of emotional manipulation, of packaging personal hardship into digestible, monetizable content. The irony was heavy. A podcast about authenticity ended up raising more doubts than trust. But the emotional backlash wasn't the only thing fueling the storm. Just as the noise around the Tearless moment was reaching a peak, another controversy broke out. This time, not about what Meghan said, but what she signed. In a promotional clip tied to the episode, a gift basket appeared on screen. Nestled among the flowers and the handwritten note was a signature, with the compliments of Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex. And that phrase reignited a much older debate. Since January 2020, when Meghan and Prince Harry stepped back from their roles as senior members of the royal family, the rules around their titles have been very clear. Yes, they retained the styling of His Royal Highness and Her Royal Highness, but under the Sandringham Agreement, they explicitly agreed not to use those titles in any public or commercial capacity. It was a mutual understanding with the monarchy, retaining dignity but not the branding. So seeing Her Royal Highness on a podcast-related gift basket set off alarm bells. It wasn't a personal note to a friend or a private event. It was part of a coordinated media rollout, tied directly to Meghan's image, message, and by extension, her brand. In the eyes of many, it was a breach, not just of a formality, but of public trust. UK media outlets, including the Daily Mail and GB News, picked it up immediately. Headlines called it defiant, misleading, and out of touch. Royal commentators explained the distinction again for audiences unfamiliar with the terms. Yes, Meghan still technically holds the title, but using it publicly is considered inappropriate, especially in the context of commercial or media appearances. Social media, already boiling from the fake tears narrative, poured fuel on the fire. Hashtags like #NotYourTitle and #YouLeft for Netflix started trending in the United Kingdom and then crossed into the United States. Even Meghan's defenders had trouble explaining it away. There was no denial from her team, no correction. The signature remained visible in clips and screenshots. For many, it confirmed a long-running suspicion that Meghan hadn't let go of the royal spotlight as much as she claimed. Critics argued that despite moving to the United States, distancing herself from royal duties, and signing deals with entertainment platforms, she still leaned on the prestige of royalty to shape her public narrative. And it was that contradiction that caused the deepest damage. On one hand, Meghan continues to position herself as independent, self-made, and removed from royal protocol. On the other hand, small decisions, like a title on a card, suggest she's still trading on that very identity. The podcast was intended to be a reset, a fresh reintroduction to the world. Instead, it amplified every criticism that had been building for years. With the title debate gaining momentum, royal experts began weighing in. They reminded audiences that King Charles, to this day, has chosen not to strip Harry and Meghan of their titles entirely. Some interpret that as grace, others as caution. But insiders have long said that Prince William would be far more decisive. For now, there's no formal response from the palace. But the headlines made their way across the Atlantic, and so did the debate. By the time the dust was settling around the royal signature controversy, a new thread started gaining momentum. Clips began popping up across YouTube and X, formerly Twitter, with titles like "Joe Rogan destroys Meghan Markle" or "Rogan reacts to Meghan's fake tears." Some had thumbnails with Joe's face superimposed next to Meghan's, usually mid-laugh or looking confused. It was everywhere. But when users clicked in, most found either older segments from previous years or commentary about the Spotify fallout, not anything directly related to the Jamie Kern Lima podcast. That didn't stop the rumor from spreading. Enough people believed that Joe Rogan had weighed in, or was about to, that the conversation took on a life of its own. After all, it wasn't a stretch. Joe Rogan has criticized Meghan Markle before, on air, with guests, and without any diplomatic filter. He famously mocked the couple during their multi-million-dollar podcast deal with Spotify, calling the whole arrangement embarrassing. That criticism came to a head when Spotify eventually dropped the Archetypes podcast in mid-2023, reportedly due to underwhelming performance and unmet expectations. Back then, Rogan made jabs at their public persona and questioned whether Meghan and Harry had any actual substance to offer. The comments went viral, as expected. and his tone made it clear he wasn't impressed with either the content or the strategy. So when the Jamie Kern Lima interview aired, and the emotional authenticity of Meghan's appearance became the new battleground, people assumed Rogan would weigh in again. They didn't need new quotes. His past words were enough. Online users began reposting Rogan's older criticisms as if they were responses to the new controversy. "This is why Joe was right," read one post, sharing a 2-minute clip of Rogan mocking celebrity victimhood. The audio had nothing to do with Meghan's latest appearance, but the caption reframed it. Commentary accounts followed suit, adding fuel to a conversation that was, technically, never even started by Rogan himself. Yet the perception stuck. Viewers, many already disillusioned by the podcast and the HRH signature, accepted the rumor as fact. In the digital age, it no longer matters if someone actually said something. If the tone, history, and timing align, people will connect the dots on their own. And with Rogan's track record, the idea of him mocking Meghan again felt inevitable. That sense alone added another layer of humiliation to the podcast fallout, whether it was fair or not. Beyond the rumor, more criticism began pouring in from other content creators, cultural commentators, and podcast hosts. Unlike Rogan, many of them did directly respond to the Jamie Kern Lima episode. One podcast described the entire interview as emotional theater. Another labeled it a branding play disguised as vulnerability. Some questioned the purpose of the conversation entirely. Was it an honest dialogue, or a carefully scripted narrative wrapped in soft lighting and subtle marketing? The promotional aspect of the interview drew heavy attention. The gift basket, the jam, the calligraphy, all carried a sense of premeditated image control. The audience wasn't just responding to what Meghan said, they were responding to how she said it, when she said it, and what surrounded the message. In the eyes of many, this wasn't a conversation, it was a production. This perception wasn't helped by the way Meghan used language during the episode. At one point, she described her connection with Jamie Kern Lima in metaphysical terms, saying, "When I look into your eyes, I feel like I'm surrounded by light." For critics, this wasn't a moment of heartfelt reflection, it was a red flag. The line was clipped and memed across social media within hours. Some called it spiritual fluff. Others said it sounded like dialogue from a self-help parody. The sentiment may have been genuine, but the delivery triggered skepticism. That single line came to symbolize what many thought was wrong with the entire episode. It felt scripted, overly polished, and too focused on performance. Users online joked that the whole podcast sounded like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. And once again, Meghan's public image took a hit, not because she shared something controversial, but because people questioned whether she shared anything real. The silence from Meghan's team didn't help. There was no official statement to clarify the HRH signature, no interview to respond to the emotional backlash, and no denial of the Rogan rumors. And while silence is often strategic, in this case it created more confusion than control. Without context, the narrative became whatever the loudest voices decided it would be. That silence also gave space for previous narratives to resurface. People began revisiting the Spotify fallout from the year before. After Archetypes failed to deliver a second season, and the couple's audio deal quietly fell apart, questions had already been raised about how much value Meghan could bring to the podcast space. Spotify executive Bill Simmons called the couple grifters, a quote that made headlines globally. At the time, many dismissed it as overly harsh. But now, in light of the Jamie Kern Lima interview, some saw it as prophetic. There was also the matter of Archetypes itself. The podcast, launched in 2022, had been heavily promoted and was positioned as a new avenue for Meghan to explore issues of gender and identity. But after one season, it disappeared. Despite early success on Spotify charts, industry insiders reported that Meghan's production team struggled to deliver consistent episodes or meet content requirements. The deal ended quietly, and no follow-up project was announced. This context reframed her appearance on Jamie's show. To some, it looked less like a bold return to the media and more like a cautious attempt to re-enter the conversation. A test run, one might say, to see if the public was still receptive. But the results suggested otherwise. The criticisms were sharper, the backlash came faster, and the public response showed that simply appearing with emotion wasn't enough to win trust anymore. As the narrative around the podcast unraveled, public attention shifted once again, this time away from the tears and titles and towards something even more tangible: Meghan's branding. In particular, the phrase, "as ever," started drawing closer scrutiny. For those familiar with Meghan's public communications, the phrase wasn't new. She had used it before, often as a closing signature in personal letters and social media captions. But its reappearance in connection with the gift baskets from the Jamie Kern Lima podcast, specifically on handwritten tags, sparked speculation that it wasn't just a phrase anymore. It was a brand. And not just any brand, but possibly a quiet rebrand or extension of her existing lifestyle business, American Riviera Orchard. When Meghan introduced American Riviera Orchard in March 2025, it launched with cinematic flair. A stylized video posted to Instagram showed her walking through sunlit orchards, arranging flowers, and smiling over a stove. The visuals were polished and the atmosphere was warm, but the details were scarce. There was no product list, no website, no release timeline, only a name and a look. Shortly after the launch, jars of strawberry jam bearing the American Riviera Orchard label were sent to a select group of influencers and friends. These included Kris Jenner and Delphina Blaquier, the wife of close family friend Nacho Figueres. The handwritten cards attached to the jars featured the phrase, "as ever." And it was that detail, small, handwritten, and possibly overlooked, that became the next focal point in the mounting controversy. People began asking if Meghan was shifting away from American Riviera Orchard or expanding it under a new identity. The speculation intensified when searches revealed that multiple small businesses across the United States already operated under the name "as ever," many of them in adjacent categories like lifestyle, wellness, and apparel. Trademark experts began weighing in, noting that if Meghan's team planned to trademark "as ever" as a separate brand, they could face legal opposition due to name similarity and market overlap. This wasn't just theoretical. Public databases showed that several trademark applications and legal notices were in motion around the time the phrase "as ever" started gaining visibility. A few entrepreneurs spoke out anonymously to reporters, expressing concern about potential confusion or infringement. And then came a more surprising twist: claims that a town in Spain had formally objected to elements of Meghan's brand visuals. Specifically, media reports pointed to the logo used in American Riviera Orchard's promotional materials, alleging it bore a strong resemblance to the official coat of arms of the Spanish municipality of Alhaurín de la Torre. The alleged visual overlap led to discussions in intellectual property law circles about symbolic usage, heraldry protection, and international branding conflicts. While Meghan's team did not comment publicly on the matter, the comparison image circulated online, with side-by-side shots appearing in tabloids and legal blogs. The resemblance wasn't identical, but it was close enough to raise questions, especially when combined with the broader sense of brand confusion that was already spreading. For many observers, these issues were more than just legal hiccups. They pointed to a larger pattern, what critics described as an ongoing struggle to define a clear, consistent brand identity in the post-royal phase of Meghan's public life. The rollout of American Riviera Orchard had promised something elegant and intentional, but the sudden emergence of "as ever," trademark questions, and potential legal challenges suggested a campaign not entirely under control. And the timing only made it worse. Coming on the heels of a podcast already under fire for emotional inconsistency and a royal title slip, the appearance of yet another branding complication felt like part of a broader unraveling. Even supporters began to express concern. Commentators who once defended Meghan's efforts to re-establish herself outside the royal structure now asked if her team was moving too fast without tightening the details. Publications such as The Times and The Telegraph ran coverage questioning the rollout strategy. Headlines highlighted the lack of transparency around the brand's structure and the confusion between personal storytelling and soft product promotion. One article pointed out that while Meghan had spoken about authenticity and motherhood in the Jamie Kern Lima interview, the episode also doubled as a promotional moment for her products, which were never formally introduced to the public. In their view, it blurred the lines between personal reflection and strategic marketing. That blurring had long been a point of contention in Meghan's public career. Since leaving the United Kingdom, she and Prince Harry had positioned themselves as independent figures, free from palace constraints. They signed deals with Netflix, Spotify, Penguin Random House, and other major players, intended to give them a platform to tell their story on their terms. But those platforms came with expectations: content delivery, public reception, and measurable success. When archetypes failed to continue into a second season, and Spotify terminated the partnership, it raised serious questions about the commercial sustainability of Meghan's media ventures. Now, with American Riviera Orchard and possibly As Ever following the same path, heavily teased, softly launched, and mired in confusion, the critiques were no longer just about optics. They were about execution. Meanwhile, the Jamie Kern Lima podcast, instead of serving as a moment of control, had exposed deeper vulnerabilities in how Meghan managed her post-royal image. Her supporters had hoped for a strong reintroduction, but what they got was a cluster of complications. First, the emotional moment with no tears. Then, the HRH signature that reignited old arguments. And now, a branding shift that opened the door to legal scrutiny. It wasn't the scale of each issue that caused damage, it was the accumulation. In isolation, a tearless moment might have passed. A title slip could have been explained. A brand pivot might have been ignored. But together, across the span of a single media appearance, they formed a narrative of miscalculation. A narrative that critics seized upon, amplifying every flaw and undermining every intention. Just as questions around Meghan's branding were reaching their peak, another issue surfaced, one that involved real-world consequences, legal threats, and physical harm. It all traced back to a wellness recipe that had been featured in Meghan's past content, a seemingly harmless bath salt blend. But according to a woman in Maryland, that blend had caused her serious damage, and she was prepared to take legal action over it. The woman, Robin Patrick, is a diabetic who claimed that a recipe shared by Meghan, featuring Himalayan salt and arnica, among other ingredients, led to severe skin burns and ulcers after she followed it. Her lawyers stated the product caused a dangerous reaction due to her medical condition. She allegedly followed the recipe after watching it on a segment tied to Meghan's content. Though the mixture was not sold commercially, Robin's legal team argued that its presentation as a wellness recommendation on a major platform like Netflix gave it authority and implied safety. Reports emerged in early May 2025 that Robin Patrick had issued formal legal notice to Meghan Markle, Netflix, and Archewell, signaling intent to sue for damages up to $10 million. The case quickly drew public interest. It wasn't about a manufactured product. It was about an idea, a wellness recommendation, casually shared with an enormous audience. In the era of influencer responsibility, it was a reminder that even lifestyle content carries risk. For Meghan, the timing couldn't have been worse. She was already facing widespread skepticism following her podcast appearance. Her brand, American Riviera Orchard, had just launched but was already being scrutinized for inconsistencies. Now, she was entangled in a potential lawsuit that questioned the safety of her recommendations and the role of celebrity influence in health-related content. Legal analysts pointed out that while such cases are difficult to win, especially when the product is not sold, the reputational damage can be immediate and lasting. The fact that the bath salt recipe was featured in a high-profile production, one that had been streamed to global audiences, only intensified the scrutiny. Netflix had not commented publicly on the case, and Meghan's team also remained silent. But for the public, the optics were damaging. This was no longer about branding missteps or podcast awkwardness. It was now about real harm. Robin Patrick's claim gave critics a new angle. Where before they had accused Meghan of over-polishing her public image or trading on royal connections, they were now accusing her of being irresponsible, of using wellness aesthetics without scientific caution, and of influencing real people with real vulnerabilities. The case reignited debates about the role of public figures in promoting health and wellness advice. While influencers have long shared lifestyle tips, the expectation of accuracy and safety has grown. What might have passed as harmless content years ago is now held to a different standard, especially when attached to a global public figure. In Meghan's case, this came at a time when trust was already low. Critics were quick to add this to the list of concerns. To them, it wasn't just one mistake. It was the accumulation. The podcast that felt rehearsed. The signature that reignited royal debates. The unclear branding. And now, a lawsuit over an allegedly harmful recipe. Even among those who had remained supportive, there was a noticeable shift. More people began asking the same question. What exactly is the role Meghan Markle wants to play in public life? Is she a wellness entrepreneur? A media producer? A former royal with a platform? Or a celebrity influencer using her past for current visibility? The lines had become increasingly hard to follow. The media began responding in kind. Coverage widened beyond royal correspondence. Outlets that normally focused on celebrity news or legal developments started publishing stories about Meghan's string of controversies. Publications questioned how long she could continue straddling so many identities without facing stronger consequences, either from regulators, platforms, or the public itself. Throughout all this, Meghan's team maintained silence. No press statement about the lawsuit, no correction on the HRH title use, no clarification on whether As Ever was a formal rebrand. In some corners, that silence was interpreted as discipline, a strategy of letting the storm pass. But in others, it was read as avoidance, a refusal to take responsibility for what many believed was a cascading failure of judgment. Meanwhile, the royal family remained distant. King Charles, still undergoing cancer treatment, had issued no public statement regarding any of Meghan's recent controversies. Royal insiders claimed that Buckingham Palace had no intention of commenting. But some reports suggested that Prince William was taking a harder line internally. While not confirmed, insiders told several British outlets that William was increasingly frustrated with how Meghan and Harry continued to blur the boundaries between royal legacy and private profit. Public polling echoed that frustration. A late April survey conducted in the United Kingdom showed that more than 60% of respondents believed Meghan and Harry should be formally stripped of all royal titles, not just limited from using them. The survey results spread quickly through UK media and were picked up by international outlets, adding another layer of pressure to an already growing crisis. As May moved forward, Meghan's podcast appearance, initially intended as a reintroduction to public life, had now triggered a full-scale reputational storm. From emotional skepticism to royal protocol violations, from brand confusion to potential legal action, each part of the story had built upon the last. And as the narrative grew, so did the number of people asking whether this was just a string of missteps or something more fundamental. Whether Meghan intended it or not, her return to media had become a case study in how quickly public perception can turn. The very themes she had tried to center, honesty, empowerment, personal growth, were now being challenged in every headline, meme, and podcast reaction. And while there may still be room to course correct, the damage from this chapter will be hard to undo. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.